My parents abused me in childhood, but when I ran away and grew up without them, they wanted to take my company. So they sued me, but I bribed their lawyer. I don't know where to start, but I guess it makes sense to begin at the beginning. My name is Michael, and I'm the product of a marriage that probably shouldn't have happened. My earliest memories are dark and filled with confusion, two things that seem to haunt every corner of my childhood. Growing up, I never felt like I belonged. My parents, Susan and Robert, were the kind of people who had no business raising a child. Susan was a cold woman, distant and unfeeling, who seemed to view me more as an inconvenience than a son. Robert wasn't much better. He was absent most of the time, either lost in his work or in the bottom of a bottle. When he was around, he was angry, and that anger had to go somewhere. My mother made it clear from the beginning that she never wanted children. She had dreams that didn't involve the messy, noisy reality of parenthood. I was an accident, a mistake that she couldn't undo, and she made sure I knew it. It wasn't just the neglect that shaped me, it was the outright hatred. My parents didn't just ignore me, they actively despised me. I was their burden, their ball and chain. My earliest memories are of screaming matches, thrown objects, and nights spent huddled under my bed, trying to escape the storm that raged in the next room. I remember one night in particular, one that still wakes me up in a cold sweat. I was maybe 5 or 6, and I had done something that set them off. I can't even remember what it was, but I remember the aftermath. The sound of glass shattering, the feel of cold liquid running down my face, and the searing pain that followed. My father had thrown a bottle at me, the glass cutting into my skin. I screamed, not just from the pain, but from the shock. My mother, rather than rushing to help, simply looked at me with disgust. "Stop your whining," she hissed. "You're pathetic." That was the night I learned not to cry, not to show any weakness. It was the night I started to build the walls that would protect me from them, from the world. School wasn't any better. If home was a battlefield, school was a minefield. I was the weird kid, the one who never talked, the one who wore the same clothes day after day because my parents couldn't be bothered to buy me new ones. The teachers looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance, as if I was a problem they didn't know how to solve. I was always alone, the kid who sat in the corner during recess, pretending to read a book while the other kids laughed and played. But they didn't leave me alone. No, they made sure to remind me every day that I was different, that I didn't belong. There was one boy, Kevin, who seemed to make it his life's mission to make mine a living hell. He was bigger than me, stronger, and he knew how to use that strength to his advantage. It started with the usual stuff name calling, pushing me in the hallways, but it quickly escalated. He would corner me after school, taunting me, daring me to fight back. But I never did. I just took it, because what else was I supposed to do? I remember the day Kevin decided to up the ante. It was a Tuesday, I think. We were in the bathroom, and he and his friends had cornered me again. But this time, he didn't just shove me or call me names. This time he pulled out a lighter. "Want to see something cool?" he asked, grinning. I didn't answer. I just stood there, frozen, as he flicked the lighter on and off, on and off. The flame danced in the dim light, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "You scared, Mikey?" he sneered. "You gonna cry?" I didn't cry. I didn't make a sound. But inside, I was screaming. He lunged at me, grabbing my arm and holding the lighter close to my skin. I could feel the heat, the pain, but I didn't fight back. I just stood there, waiting for it to be over. When he finally let go, I ran. I didn't stop running until I was home, my arm blistered and raw. But when I walked through the door, there was no one there to help me. No one cared. My parents didn't even notice. It wasn't just Kevin. The teachers, the other kids, they all played their part in making my life a living nightmare. I was the scapegoat, the punching bag. I remember one teacher, Mrs. Thompson, who seemed to take a special pleasure in humiliating me. She would call on me in class, knowing full well that I didn't know the answer, and then berate me in front of everyone when I got it wrong. "You're never going to amount to anything, Michael," she would say, her voice dripping with contempt. "Why do you even bother coming to school?" I didn't have an answer for her. I didn't have an answer for anyone. I was just trying to survive. But it wasn't just the physical and emotional abuse that left scars. It was the secrets. The things that happened in the dark, when no one else was around. Things that I couldn't tell anyone about, not even if I wanted to. There was a man someone my parents knew. He would come over sometimes, usually when my father was too drunk to care. He would take me to the basement, away from prying eyes, and do things that no child should ever have to endure. I tried to tell my mother once. I told her what he did, what he made me do. But she didn't believe me. She slapped me across the face and told me to stop making up stories. That was the last time I ever tried to tell anyone. I learned to keep my mouth shut, to keep my head down, to blend into the background. I became invisible, a ghost in my own life. I stopped feeling, stopped caring, because it was the only way to survive. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the darkness that seemed to follow me everywhere. It was always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to swallow me whole. One day when I was about 12, something inside me snapped. I had come home from school, bloodied and bruised from yet another run-in with Kevin. My mother was sitting in the living room smoking a cigarette and watching TV. I walked past her hoping she wouldn't notice me, but she did. "What the hell happened to you?" she demanded, her voice cold and harsh. "Nothing," I muttered, trying to keep my head down. "Don't you lie to me," she snapped. "Who did this to you?" I didn't answer. I just stood there staring at the floor, my fists clenched at my sides. "I asked you a question, Michael," she shouted, grabbing my arm and yanking me around to face her. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was the years of abuse, the constant pain and humiliation. Maybe it was just the sight of her, so cold and unfeeling, that pushed me over the edge. But in that moment, I lost control. I shoved her, hard. She stumbled back, a look of shock on her face, and for a moment, I thought I had won. But then her expression changed, and I knew I had made a terrible mistake. She came at me, fists flying, and I knew there was no going back. She hit me over and over, screaming obscenities, telling me how worthless I was, how she wished I had never been born. I didn't fight back. I just let her hit me, let her get it all out. Because in that moment, I didn't care anymore. I didn't care about anything. When she finally stopped, when she was too exhausted to continue, she just stood there, breathing heavily, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and something else, something that looked a lot like fear. "Get out of my sight," she hissed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never want to see you again." I didn't argue. I just turned and walked away out of the house, out into the cold night. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I walked for hours, my mind numb, my body aching. I ended up at the park, the one place where I had always felt safe. It was late, and the park was empty, the playground cast in eerie shadows by the moonlight. I sat on the swing staring up at the sky, wondering how my life had come to this. How had I ended up so broken, so lost? Was there any way out, or was I doomed to live in this darkness forever? I don't know how long I sat there lost in my thoughts. But eventually, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, expecting to see a stranger, but instead, it was Kevin. He was alone, his face twisted into a cruel smile as he approached me. I didn't move. I just sat there waiting for whatever was going to happen next. "You look like shit, Mikey," he sneered, stopping in front of me. "What's the matter? Mommy and Daddy finally had enough of you?" I didn't answer. I just stared at him, my eyes blank, my heart empty. He must have seen something in my expression, something that made him pause, because he didn't hit me. He just stood there, staring at me, his smile fading. "You're pathetic," he muttered, shaking his head. "You're not even worth the trouble." And then he walked away, leaving me alone in the darkness. I don't know how long I sat there after he left. Hours, maybe. But eventually, I stood up and started walking again, aimlessly, with no destination in mind. I ended up at the edge of town, near the train tracks. I stood there, staring at the tracks, wondering if maybe, just maybe, it would be easier to end it all. To step onto those tracks and let the train take me away from all the pain, all the darkness. But I didn't do it. Something inside me, some small spark of life, kept me from taking that final step. I turned away from the tracks and started walking again, back towards home. When I got there, the house was dark and silent. My parents were asleep, or maybe they just didn't care enough to wait up for me. I crept inside, careful not to make a sound, and made my way to my room. I lay down on my bed, staring up at the ceiling, my mind racing. I didn't cry. I didn't feel anything. I was just empty. That was the night I realized that I was truly alone, that there was no one in the world who cared about me. no one who would miss me if I were gone. But I didn't die that night. I kept going, kept surviving because that's all I knew how to do. I became a master at hiding, at blending in, at making myself invisible. I learned to navigate the minefield that was my life, avoiding the explosions, taking the hits when I couldn't avoid them. I became numb to the pain, to the fear, to the loneliness. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the darkness that had taken root inside me. It was always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to consume me. And sometimes, late at night, when the world was quiet and I was alone with my thoughts, I would wonder if maybe, just maybe, it would be easier to let it. When I look back on that cold day in the park, it's hard to believe how much my life changed. I was at my lowest, with nothing to live for and nowhere to go. But that day, a man named David Matthews found me, and my world shifted in ways I never could have imagined. David was kind and patient, traits that were foreign to me. He didn't push, didn't pry, but he offered a warmth and understanding I'd never experienced. When he invited me to his home, I resisted at first, out of habit and fear. But hunger and exhaustion eventually won out, and I accepted his offer. David's house was small and unassuming, tucked away at the edge of town. It was nothing like the house I grew up in. There were no yelling voices, no threats lurking around every corner. Instead, it was filled with the smell of wood and freshly brewed coffee. It was a home, something I'd never truly known. That night, I slept in a bed that was soft and warm, in a room that was mine. I had never had a room to myself before. I had never known what it felt like to be safe, to not have to worry about someone barging in, about the next beating or the next cruel word. It was like stepping into a different world. In the days that followed, David began to gently coax me out of the shell I had built around myself. He introduced me to books, filling my mind with stories of adventure and hope, giving me an escape from the darkness that had plagued me for so long. He taught me about trust, about what it meant to care for someone without expecting anything in return. And slowly, I began to heal. David also recognized something in me that no one else had ever seen potential. He encouraged me to go back to school, to finish my education, and to dream of a future beyond the life I had known. I was hesitant, scared even, but with his support, I took the plunge. Going back to school was a challenge. I was years behind my peers, and the thought of facing classrooms full of teenagers who were light years ahead of me academically was terrifying. But David was there every step of the way. He worked with me on my homework, helped me catch up on everything I had missed, and when I felt like giving up, he reminded me of how far I had come. In time, school became more than just a place to learn. It became a place where I started to find myself. I met Sarah and James in my senior year, two people who would become my closest friends. Sarah was bright, full of energy, and had a smile that could light up a room. James was quieter, but loyal and thoughtful. They were the first people my age who looked at me as a friend, not a freak or an outcast. We bonded over late-night study sessions, shared our dreams and fears, and talked about the future like it was something within our grasp. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could have a future worth living. David officially adopted me when I turned 16. I can still remember the day we went to the courthouse, just the two of us. The judge asked if I understood what it meant, and I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. When the adoption was finalized, I was overcome with emotion. For the first time in my life, I had a father, someone who chose me, someone who wanted me. It was a simple ceremony, but it meant the world to me. After graduation, Sarah, James, and I made a pact we would go to university together. We spent months preparing, filling out applications, visiting campuses, and planning our future. When we all got accepted into the same university, it felt like a dream come true. University was a fresh start, a place where no one knew about my past. I threw myself into my studies, determined to succeed. But university was also a place full of challenges I hadn't anticipated. In the beginning, everything seemed perfect. I was living in a dorm with James, while Sarah was just a few doors down. We took classes together, joined clubs, and made new friends. It felt like we were on top of the world. But as the semesters went on, the pressures of university life started to build. There were the late nights studying for exams, the overwhelming workload, and the constant pressure to succeed. And while most people were supportive, there were those who saw me as an easy target. It started innocently enough, a few snide comments here and there, jokes about where I came from, about how I didn't belong. I tried to ignore them, focusing on my studies and my friends. But the comments kept coming, growing nastier with each passing week. There was a group of students, rich, privileged kids who had never known hardship, who seemed to take pleasure in making my life difficult. They were led by a guy named Ethan, the kind of person who oozed arrogance and entitlement. Ethan made it his mission to remind me every day that I wasn't one of them, that I was an outsider. The harassment escalated quickly. My textbooks went missing, my assignments were accidentally deleted from my computer, and my dorm room was vandalized more than once. The final straw came one night when I returned to my room to find it trashed, my belongings scattered everywhere, and a bottle of ink poured all over my notes. I felt the old anger, the helplessness rising up inside me, but this time I couldn't push it down. I was done being their victim. I was done letting them win. The next day, I confronted Ethan and his friends in the courtyard. I don't remember everything I said, but I remember the feeling like a dam breaking, all the years of pain and rage flooding out in a torrent. I tore into them with words I didn't know I had in me, exposing their insecurities, their weaknesses, until they were the ones crumbling under the pressure. By the time I was done, they were on their knees, crying and begging for forgiveness. I didn't feel triumph or satisfaction, just an overwhelming sense of release, like a weight I had been carrying for years had finally been lifted. Word spread quickly about what had happened, and no one bothered me after that. But the experience left me shaken, a reminder that the darkness inside me was still there, waiting to be unleashed. I realized then that I couldn't just bury the pain of my past, I had to confront it, deal with it, if I was ever going to move forward. David was a rock during this time. When I told him what had happened, he didn't judge me or lecture me. He simply listened, offering his unwavering support. He understood better than anyone what it meant to carry the burden of a painful past, and he helped me find a way to channel my anger into something positive. I started seeing a therapist on David's suggestion, someone who helped me unpack the trauma I had buried for so long. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I wanted to quit, but slowly, I began to heal. I learned how to manage my emotions, how to forgive myself, and how to let go of the anger that had defined me for so long. University wasn't all darkness, though. There were moments of joy, of laughter, of pure happiness that I had never known before. Sarah, James, and I became inseparable, our bond growing stronger with each passing year. We celebrated each other's successes, supported each other through failures, and dreamed of the future we would build together. In our final year, we all started thinking seriously about what came next. Sarah had always wanted to be a journalist, and she landed an internship at a prestigious newspaper. James was passionate about technology and started developing an app that quickly gained attention from investors. As for me, I had found a love for finance, a way to channel my need for control and order into something productive. With graduation looming, we began to make plans for the future. We found a small apartment in the city, the three of us deciding to live together while we figured out our next steps. It wasn't much, but it was ours, and it felt like the start of something new and exciting. Graduation day was surreal. As I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, I felt a sense of pride that I'd never known before. I had made it. I had survived everything life had thrown at me, and I had come out the other side stronger, more resilient, and ready to take on the world. After graduation, things moved quickly. Sarah's internship turned into a full-time job, and she quickly made a name for herself as a rising star in journalism. James' app took off, attracting significant investment, and he started his own tech company. I joined a top financial firm, a job I had never imagined I would be qualified for, and threw myself into the work. But life after university wasn't without its challenges. The corporate world was cutthroat, and I found myself facing new forms of pressure and stress. There were times when I felt like I was drowning, but I had my friends, and I had David, and they helped me keep my head above water. One of the most shocking moments came about a year after graduation. I was working late one night when I got a call from James. His voice was panicked, something I had never heard from him before. "Michael, you need to come to the office," he said, his voice shaking. "It's Sarah." I felt my heart drop. I didn't ask questions, I just grabbed my coat and rushed to James' office. When I arrived, I found Sarah sitting on the floor of the conference room, tears streaming down her face. She was holding a letter, her hands trembling. "What's going on?" I asked, rushing to her side. James handed me the letter, his expression grim. It was from the newspaper she worked for, informing her that they were shutting down her section, effective immediately. She was being let go. "It's all falling apart," she whispered, her voice broken. "Everything I've worked for, I didn't know what to say. Sarah had put everything into her career, and now it was being taken away from her in an instant." I pulled her into a hug, holding her as she cried, while James paced the room, his own anxiety palpable. In the days that followed, we rallied around Sarah, helping her navigate the shock and uncertainty. She fell into a deep depression, struggling to find meaning after losing the job that had defined her. But we didn't let her fall. We were there for her, just as she had always been there for us. It was a long road, but Sarah eventually found her footing again. She started freelancing, writing for smaller publications and slowly rebuilding her career. It wasn't easy, and there were many setbacks, but she persevered. And through it all, our friendship remained strong, a constant in a world that was always changing. As for me, I continued to climb the corporate ladder, earning promotions and accolades along the way. But no matter how much success I achieved, I never forgot where I came from or the people who had helped me get there. One day, while visiting David, I had a realization. I was sitting in his living room, talking about work, when he looked at me with that same thoughtful expression he had when we first met. "You've done well for yourself, Michael," he said, his voice filled with pride. "But don't forget to take a step back every now and then. Life isn't just about success. It's about the people you share it with." His words stuck with me. I had been so focused on my career, on proving to myself and everyone else that I was worth something, that I had lost sight of what really mattered. I realized then that I needed to find balance, to make time for the people I cared about. In the years that followed, I made a conscious effort to do just that. I spent more time with David, who was getting older, but still as sharp and kind as ever. I made sure to stay connected with Sarah and James, even as our lives took us in different directions. We still lived together, but our jobs often kept us apart, and I wanted to make sure we didn't drift away from each other. And then, something happened that shook all of us to our core. James' company, the one he had poured his heart and soul into, was facing a hostile takeover. It was unexpected, ruthless, and it left him reeling. "They're going to take everything," he said one night, his voice filled with despair. "Everything I've worked for, it's all going to be gone." I had never seen James so defeated, so lost. He had always been the calm, steady one, the rock we could all lean on. But now, he was the one who needed support. Sarah and I rallied around him, just as we had with Sarah when she lost her job. We spent countless hours strategizing, looking for ways to fend off the takeover, but it felt like we were fighting a losing battle. In the end, the takeover happened, and James lost control of his company. It was a devastating blow, and for a while it seemed like he might never recover. But James was stronger than he realized. With our support, he picked himself up, dusted himself off, and started over. He used the money from the buyout to start a new venture, one that was smaller but more aligned with his values. And in time, he found success again. The years passed, and life continued to throw challenges our way. But through it all, we remained a team of family, in every sense of the word. We celebrated each other's successes, supported each other through failures, and faced every obstacle together. Looking back, I realized that David didn't just save me that day in the park. He gave me a life worth living. He showed me what it meant to be loved, to be valued, and to have a future filled with hope. And for that, I will always be grateful. As I sit here reflecting on everything that has happened, I can't help but feel a deep sense of pride. I've come a long way from the scared, broken kid I once was. I've built a life I never thought possible, surrounded by people I love and who love me in return. Success had a way of attracting attention, and not always the good kind. After years of building my life from the ground up, of turning my pain into power and my struggles into success, I had managed to carve out a space for myself in the world. I had a thriving company, good friends, and a future I was proud of. But just when I thought I had finally left the shadows of my past behind, they came back to haunt me in the most unexpected way. It started with a phone call I never expected to receive. I was in my office going over some reports when my assistant buzzed in. "Michael, there's someone on the line claiming to be your parents," she said, her voice laced with confusion. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I hadn't seen or heard from Susan and Robert in years, not since the day I walked out of their house and into David's care. They had made it clear that I was nothing to them, and I had spent my life trying to forget they ever existed. "Put them through," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil churning inside me. There was a click, and then I heard a voice I hadn't heard in over a decade. "Michael," my mother's voice crackled through the line. "It's been a long time." I didn't respond immediately. I wasn't sure what to say, or even if I wanted to say anything at all. "We need to talk," she continued, her tone sharp, as if she were giving me an order. "What do you want?" I asked, keeping my voice as neutral as possible. "It's about the company," she said, and I could hear the greed dripping from her words. "We've heard you've done well for yourself, and well, we're your parents. We're entitled to a share of what you've built." I clenched my fist under the desk, anger boiling beneath the surface. Entitled? After everything they had done, after all the pain and suffering they had caused, they had the audacity to demand something from me? "You have no right to anything I've built," I said coldly. "You are not my parents. You stopped being my parents the day you threw me away." There was a pause, and then my father's voice came on the line, slurred and unsteady. He was drunk, no surprise there. "Listen here, boy," he growled. "We raised you. We put a roof over your head, fed you, clothed you. You owe us." I felt the rage rising, memories of every beating, every cruel word flashing through my mind. "You didn't raise me," I snapped. "You abused me. You neglected me. You're nothing to me." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line, and then my mother's voice came back, this time laced with venom. "We'll see about that," she hissed. "We'll see what the courts have to say about this. You can't just walk away from your family, Michael. You owe us, and we're going to get what we deserve." The line went dead, and I sat there, seething with anger and disbelief. I had always known that my parents were toxic, but this was a new level of low, even for them. For a few days, I tried to push the conversation out of my mind, focusing on work and the life I had built. But then, a week later, a letter arrived official, cold and threatening. My parents were suing me for a share of my company, claiming that as my biological parents, they were entitled to a portion of my assets. I knew then that this wasn't going to go away. They weren't just after money, they wanted to tear down everything I had built, to drag me back into the darkness I had fought so hard to escape. But I wasn't that scared, broken kid anymore. I wasn't going to let them win. The first step was to hire a lawyer, a good one. I had made enough connections over the years to know exactly who to call. I reached out to Jessica Morton, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney who had a reputation for being ruthless in the courtroom. I had met her a few years back at a charity event, and I knew she was the one I needed in my corner. Jessica was tall and commanding, with a presence that demanded attention. She listened intently as I explained the situation, her expression growing more serious with every word. "They don't have a leg to stand on, Michael," she said, after I had finished. "But that doesn't mean they won't try to drag this out and make your life hell in the process. Are you prepared for that?" I nodded. "I've been through worse, Jessica. I just want to make sure they don't get a single cent from me." She gave me a tight smile. "Then let's make sure they don't." The lawsuit proceeded quickly. My parents, clearly desperate for money, had hired a cheap lawyer named Gary Thompson. Gary was a shifty character, with a reputation for taking on cases no one else would touch and losing them. He wasn't much of a threat, but I knew better than to underestimate anyone in a legal battle. Jessica and I went over every detail of the case, preparing for the worst. She helped me gather evidence from my childhood medical records, old police reports, and even testimony from neighbors who had witnessed the abuse. It wasn't easy dredging up all those memories, but I knew it was necessary if I wanted to win. We also made a strategic move. Jessica reached out to Gary Thompson with an offer, a bribe, really, though we didn't call it that. The idea was simple: we'd offer him a payout if he agreed to intentionally bungle the case. Given his reputation and the fact that he was likely being paid peanuts by my parents, it didn't take much to convince him. "Are you sure this is the best approach?" I asked Jessica, feeling a bit uneasy about the plan. She looked at me with a level gaze. "It's not about fairness, Michael. It's about winning. And if this makes the difference between you losing everything or keeping what's rightfully yours, then it's worth it." With Gary on our side, the trial became more of a formality than a real fight, but that didn't mean it was easy. Walking into that courtroom and seeing my parents sitting there, smug and self-assured, was like stepping back into a nightmare. They had aged, their faces lined with bitterness, but their eyes still held that same malice I remembered from my childhood. The trial was presided over by Judge Eleanor Grant, a woman known for her fairness and no-nonsense attitude. She was in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled back into a neat bun and sharp, piercing eyes that missed nothing. I could tell from the moment she entered the courtroom that she wasn't going to put up with any nonsense. The trial began with Gary presenting my parents' case. It was pathetic, really. He stumbled over his words, failed to provide any substantial evidence, and even managed to contradict himself on more than one occasion. It was clear that he was in over his head, and Judge Grant's patience was wearing thin. When it was Jessica's turn, she took control of the courtroom with the same commanding presence she had in her office. She laid out the facts with precision, presenting the evidence of my parents' abuse and neglect with chilling clarity. She didn't hold back, describing in detail the injuries I had suffered at my father's hands, the nights I had spent alone and afraid, and the years of emotional torment they had put me through. As she spoke, I could see my parents' smug expressions begin to falter. They hadn't expected this. They had thought they could intimidate me, manipulate me, just like they had when I was a child. But now, they were facing the truth, laid bare for everyone to see. Jessica called me to the stand, and as I walked up, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. This was my moment, my chance to finally tell my story, to stand up to the people who had tried to destroy me. I took a deep breath as I faced the courtroom, my eyes locking with my parents. "I'm not here to seek revenge," I began, my voice steady. "I'm here to tell the truth." I recounted the horrors of my childhood, the beatings, the neglect, the constant fear. I spoke about the day I left, the day I found David, and how he had saved me from a life of despair. I described how I had worked tirelessly to build something of my own, to create a life worth living. And then I told them why I would never give my parents a single cent of what I had earned. "They didn't raise me," I said, my voice growing stronger with every word. "They tried to break me. They didn't care if I lived or died. And now, after all these years, they think they can come back into my life and take what I've built. But they're wrong. They're not my parents. They're just people who happened to give birth to me, and they have no right to anything I've accomplished." When I finished, the courtroom was silent. Judge Grant looked at me with something that almost resembled respect, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I had said what needed to be said, and I had no regrets. Jessica wrapped up our case with a closing argument that left no room for doubt. "Michael owes these people nothing," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "They abandoned him, abused him, and now they're trying to take advantage of his success. But the law is on Michael's side, and I trust that this court will see the truth for what it is." The judge called for a brief recess before delivering her verdict. I sat in the courtroom, my heart pounding in my chest, while my parents whispered furiously to each other. I could see the fear in their eyes now, the realization that they were losing, that they had underestimated me. When Judge Grant returned, the room fell silent. She looked at my parents with a cold, steely gaze before delivering her judgment. "After reviewing all the evidence, it is clear that the plaintiffs have no legal claim to the defendant's assets," she said. "The evidence presented by the defense is overwhelming, and it paints a picture of a young man who has overcome unimaginable hardship to achieve success. The plaintiffs, on the other hand, have shown nothing but greed and a complete lack of remorse for their actions." She turned her attention to me. "Michael, you have shown great strength and resilience in the face of adversity. This court commends you for your achievements, and I hope you can now move forward, free from the burdens of your past." With that, she dismissed the case, and it was over. I had won. But it wasn't just a legal victory, it was a personal one. I had stood up to my parents, confronted my demons, and come out stronger on the other side. As I left the courtroom, Jessica walked beside me, a satisfied smile on her face. "You did well, Michael," she said. "I'm proud of you." I nodded, feeling a sense of closure I hadn't expected. "Thank you, Jessica. I couldn't have done it without you." Outside the courthouse, I saw my parents one last time. They were standing on the steps, looking defeated, lost in their own misery. For a moment, I felt a pang of pity for them, but it was fleeting. They had made their choices, and now they were living with the consequences. I didn't say anything to them as I walked past. I didn't need to. I had said everything that needed to be said in that courtroom, and now it was time to move on. The victory was bittersweet, but it was a victory nonetheless. I returned to my life, to my friends, to the company I had worked so hard to build, and for the first time, I felt like I could finally put the past behind me. David was waiting for me at home, his eyes full of pride as I walked through the door. He didn't say much, just pulled me into a hug, and I knew that he understood. He had been there for me when no one else was, and now, with the trial behind me, I felt like I could finally start living the life he had always wanted for me. As the months passed, I threw myself back into work, determined to continue building the life I had fought so hard for. The company grew, and with it my sense of purpose and fulfillment. I stayed close to Sarah and James, our bond stronger than ever after everything we had been through together. There were still challenges, life is never without them, but I faced them with a new sense of confidence. I had confronted the darkest parts of my past and come out stronger on the other side, and I knew that whatever came next, I would be ready. Looking back now, I realized that the trial was more than just a legal battle. It was a reckoning, a chance for me to finally close the chapter on a part of my life that had haunted me for so long. It was a chance to reclaim my story, to take ownership of my life, and to say once and for all that I was no longer a victim. And as I look to the future, I do so with hope, with strength, and with the knowledge that I am in control of my destiny. Because I am no longer defined by the people who tried to break me, I am defined by the life I have built, by the people who love me, and by the strength I have found within myself. And that, more than anything, is the greatest victory of all.